It was the year 2001 when I got my very own cathode ray tube, CRT, the first of many. That's 12-year-old me on my confirmation. And that right there is a 14-inch NEC. With RF and composite video inputs, it was more than ample to play my Sega Master System and Sony PlayStation. That is for the next 6 years, until I upgraded to an LCD and the NEC was relegated to wardrobe storage. After the 6th generation of home consoles, standard definition CRTs fell by the wayside to HD flat panels. But even so, the allure of the CRT was drawing me back in.
Marco, don't forget about me.
With a light gun in hand, I was reacquainted to the CRT. In my composite video oblivion, I was none the wiser that this TV, and many just like it, harbored a signal that would close the gap to a professional monitor. RGB. A year after I renewed my CRT vows, I got my first set of PVMs, a 14 and 20 N6, and these entry-level 500 TV line monitors opened my eyes to the wonderful world of RGB. I later taught myself the art of soldering and eventually grew a set of coglione to start tinkering with CRTs. And it didn't take me long to unlock the power of RGB on a consumer TV. Thanks to many hobbyists in the scene, there's extensive guides and forum posts that's chock full of information. But if the TV, chassis, or even jungle chip hasn't been documented, understanding the relatively universal principles of CRT RGB modding is the key. And it can be relatively simple if you know what to look for and know what you're doing. So here's a stern warning. Working on CRTs can be dangerous and if not lethal. You should not attempt to open up or fix any CRT without having good understanding of safety precautions. And if you choose to proceed, then do so at your own risk. None other than Human CRT Encyclopedia, DJ Cal, taught me the fundamentals of RGB modding by breaking down the Scart standard. For the sake of simplicity, let's ignore all but 5 pins: red, green, blue, composite video, and fast blanking. RGB is pretty self-explanatory. It's red, green, and blue analog video. Composite video also carries composite sync, i.e. the synchronization signal. Consumer Scart TVs use the RGB-S format, and sync gets extracted from composite video, but TVs with RGB will usually also take sync on Luma, which is used in component at S video, or clean 75 ohm C-Sync. An external device like a game console sends a small amount of voltage to the fast blanking pin on the TV's video chip, which tells the TV to use the incoming RGB signals. And if no blanking voltage is present, the TV falls back onto composite video, so no matter what, the user gets a picture. 1 to 3 volt for fast blanking is the Scart standard, and Scart cables for game consoles are wired with 5 volt to the blanking pin 16. A TV's jungle chip with RGB inputs, aka video or chroma IC, relies on these 5 signals to switch input modes. So I approached the mod like a factory worker that forgot to put in the Scart socket and missing components, which on each RGB line generally consists of a 75 ohm terminating resistor and a 0.1 microfarad non-polarized capacitor, a common circuit to achieve 700 mV RGB on a 100 IRE screen. The role of the resistor is to match the termination impedance of the input device as standard in analog video, and the capacitor filters out DC voltage and is usually the final component in the chain before the signal enters the jungle chip. To show how an RGB mod is executed, I've picked a Sharp VT3448X VCR combo because the principles that make up the 700mV RGB circuit needs careful adjustments to comply with the TV's jungle chip. The first step of any CRT RGB mod is to look up the datasheet of the jungle chip. Open up the TV and you might see two large ICs. One is the MyCom or mini computer, which performs most of the brain tasks such as generating an on-screen display, and the other is the jungle IC, which processes all incoming video signals. They can have numerous RGB inputs, sometimes all analog and other times a mixture of digital, generally for the OSD, and they can sometimes have no RGB inputs whatsoever. Later sets combine these two functions into one chip, which usually have poorer suitability for modding, as the RGB inputs can be locked by software, which would require something like a bus pirate to change the bit data. If you're buying a CRT and want to know if it's capable of RGB, your first port of call is to search for any existing mods. There's a TV RGB mod thread on Shmups with many prominent contributors in the scene that is still active to this day. If it's not listed anywhere online, then look for the TV schematic or equivalent chassis. In the case of the Sharp VCR combo, it uses a TB1226DN and the schematic shows several pins with RGB. Pins 12, 13 and 14 are the amplified outputs going to the neckboard. Don't touch those. 18, 19 and 20 are digital RGB, which are connected to the MyCom to receive the digital OSD. And over here, unoccupied pins 23, 24 and 25 are the analog RGB inputs, and pin 22 YS stands for fast blanking. Don't ask me why. Search for the video chip's datasheet, and if the PDF is complete, you should find a map with all the pins, an application circuit, or at least a test circuit, and a description of each pin that lists their typical input voltage. For RGB blanking to occur, pin 22 needs at least half a volt, and the analog RGB inputs expect peak-to-peak 500mV for a 100 IRE screen. And for this incoming 500mV signal, the application circuit has the 75 ohm termination,
terminated,
and a 1 microfarad polarized capacitor. The example RGB circuit I showed previously, which consisted of a 0.1 microfarad cap prior to the 75 ohm termination, is suited for 700mV peak-to-peak RGB levels. But this chip needs to receive 500mV with an inline resistor prior to termination. Several sources online recommended a value of 30 ohm, but once I've got the circuit connected to the jungle chip, I'll check the voltage to see what it's receiving. For blanking, as little as half a volt will do. You could rely on the console to deliver 5 volt and make the mod switchless, just like a factory Scart TV, but I prefer blanking to have its own switch so I can force RGB if I'm connecting something like an Extron Emosha that only sends video without blanking. So I'll need to find a stable internal DC power source somewhere on the chassis. Depending on the CRT chassis, it may have the through-hole provisions to retrofit some of the missing components. Remove any capacitors that tie the RGB blanking lines to ground, then beep out the pins to see which pads they lead to. Here's a spot for the AC coupling capacitors, which connect to the RGB pins on the jungle chip. And on the other side of the caps are through holes designated for resistors, but the other end does not lead to ground. So I'll solder the Scart RGB conductors and one end of the terminating resistors here, and terminate the other end to a close by ground point. For the inline resistors, I'll tack them onto the Scart port to not cram this area and help keep it looking tidy. To the right is a test point that outputs a steady 1.6 volt for blanking. Using a simple push button with a single pole, single throw, I'll wire the jumper to one side of the switch and pin 22 of the jungle chip to the other to initiate blanking. As for ground and sync, these can be tapped directly onto the composite or S-Video Luma input of the TV. With numerous stages to separate the composite signal, running sync through the TV's composite video input will have considerable horizontal shift when switching from composite to RGB. Whereas Luma needs less filtering and signal separation, so if the TV has an S-Video input, then that should be your first preference for sync. Scart gets a lot of hate from non-Europeans, and I can see why. Its bulky form lacks reinforcement to prevent it slipping out from the port. But it's just one of several methods for conducting signals from one device to the next. If you're not a fan of Scart, then use whatever you prefer. HD 15, breakout RCA or BNC, whatever suits your setup. If you're working with a security or semi-pro monitor of sorts, unless you've got the tools to cut through metal, you may want to consider mounting a plastic project box instead. Martin Heinfeld designed some pretty slick 3D printed Scart cases that can be no-cut mounted onto the rear vents using zip ties. Just plan ahead before you cut and ensure it goes on the opposite side of the flyback to reduce potential EMI. From experience, I find it convenient using a male to female port inside the TV in case I need to disconnect the rear case. Only trouble is laboriously soldering each end of the ports, and there's much better implementations like Sunther's Muxboard, which has a 10-pin IDC connector, so you'd only need to wire one set of conductors. If you do use a DB9 connector like me, then don't forget to insulate the metal shield to avoid shorting on anything inside the TV. Good old Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. On the first power on, I had all the RGB colors but no whites. Scart cables have 6 ground wires, but the El Cheapo PS1 cable I was using only conducted 1 Scart ground, which was literally the only one I didn't connect to the TV's new Scart port. So after I dealt with that minor issue, I had to see if the Jungle Chip's RGB pins were receiving 500mV on a 100 IRE screen. These old consoles aren't exactly precision tools and will probably have varying output levels. With a loaded 75 ohm resistor to ground, the RGB channels output approximately 660mV. With 30 ohm inline resistors, the RGB levels are actually a little hot for the Jungle Chip, measuring 650mV. But running the video so hot will blend the RGB levels to the point where there's less appreciable difference in color depth, and worst case, damage the Jungle Chip. I removed the 30 ohm resistors in lieu of 47 ohm, which achieved 600mV. Close, but still too hot. I went up to 75 ohm resistors, which drops the initial 660mV RGB to 560. Still not 500, but it'll do. At 560mV, each RGB channels look more distinguished to its neighbouring square. It needed a small bump in brightness to see channels 1 and 2, and that's it. RGB mod is optimized. If altering the brightness blows out composite video, there's other controls that'll only affect that signal and not RGB, so you should be able to get both signals relatively close in brightness and contrast. And now, show your friends. RGB mods have a range of difficulty, and sometimes you hit the jackpot when there's a footprint for a 21-pin Scart port, just like this TIAC VCR combo. How cheeky of these manufacturers to have all the components on the chassis wired for RGB, but to save a buck, withhold RGB from the Australian consumer by not installing the Scart socket. And one Scart port and snip of the shell later, this TIAC is only fugly on the outside. The NEC from my childhood is unfortunately long gone, and I found its 20-inch brother so I could see exactly what I was missing out on growing up. And just like the TIAC VCR combo, there's a 21-pin socket hidden inside, but there's missing circuitry that joins the RGB channels to the jungle chip. Thanks to DJ Cal, he sent me a schematic of the same chassis that lists the missing components. I bridged a few traces, added 2 capacitors and resistors, and wired in the blanking switch to remove the Vaseline filter, composite video. And if only 12-year-old me could see the fidelity of pure unadulterated RGB. Using the uber controversial pipeline method to calculate TV lines, the 20-inch NEC comes in at 375, so an approximate range of 350 to 400 TV lines. And cross-checking with the conventional test pattern estimation, it's definitely no more than 400. These large phosphor triads give me arcade vibes. And while professional monitors will always be sharper than most consumer TVs, an RGB mod will get you much closer. For each example I've shown on RGB mods, there's either been unoccupied analog RGB inputs on the jungle chip, or there were missing pieces in the circuit that required just a few passive components. But what if the jungle chip has a single set of RGB inputs that are occupied by the TV's on-screen display? Well, thanks to the clever work of Mark Oslad and Syntax on Shmups, there's a way to keep the OSD and display external RGB at the same time. I've only done less than a handful of Mux mods, and whilst I'm comfortable speaking on the topic, I don't have a tenth the experience as my guest speaker does implementing them. So I'm handing it over to my good friend, you've heard his name before, welcome DJ Cal.
Hi everyone, so let's talk about the OSD Mux mod. This mod specifically applies to TVs with a jungle that has a single set of RGB inputs, but they're already used by the MyCom for OSD. These days, it's pretty much the gold standard for this scenario, but it wasn't always the case. In the very first post of the Shmups forum mega thread Marco mentioned earlier, Mike Moffett breaks down the basic principles and confirms that you either have to lose OSD or route a bunch of wires through a switch. After that, people were commonly using a 4-pole double throw mechanical switch to share the one jungle input between the OSD and Scart sources. This had 2 major disadvantages. The first one is that you were running long runs of wires inside your TV, and those would be subject to interferences. The second one is you would never be able to see the OSD and your RGB input at the same time, which is not great when you want to do any kind of geometry adjustment. And if you put your switch at the back, it would be pretty awkward to access and change. And if you put it at the front, it would be an eyesore. You don't really want a big switch at the front of your TV. A couple years later, Tim Worthington of NES RGB fame stumbled across an interesting Daewoo TV. This TV has a factory RGB Scart connector, and internally it's sharing the single jungle input with OSD. Here's the block diagram. We can see up here that the Scart RGB lines are going directly to the jungle RGB inputs, but we can see a black dot here that represents an intersection. And on the left, the microcomputer, the MyCom, is sharing the same input for the OSD. The way the signals are blended together is using resistors as voltage dividers, so that both combined sources match the required peak-to-peak voltage of the jungle's RGB input. This is essentially a factory implementation of an OSD mux mod. This inspired Marco's lad and Syntax to reverse engineer the circuit and create a calculation method so it could be applied to most TVs with different MICOMs and jungles using analog RGB. They created this nifty Excel sheet that has all the calculation parameters, but for the vast majority of cases, all you need are these two tables. One for 0.7 VPP inputs and one for 0.5. So how do we use these tables? Well, let's have a closer look at the diagram. So for this exercise, let's just look at the resistors. We have resistors on the OSD side. We'll call them OSD resistors. We have resistors in line between the jungle and the Scart input. Then we have termination resistors at the edge of the Scart input. This is obviously what it looks like when the mux mod is implemented. Now let's have a look at the schematics of a chassis that we can OSD mux mod. Okay, so let's start with the MICOM and the OSD side of things. If we zoom in, we can see the RGB lines going through inline resistors of 5.6K. These are our OSD factory resistors. Let's take note of 5.6K because that's what we'll be using in the table. Now, we follow that up and it's going to this header. In this case, those are jumpers, but on the actual chassis, we'll see later, there's a header. We can see that there's termination resistors to 910. And then it all goes to the RGB inputs on the jungle. So if we go to the table, we can see that 5600 OSD inline resistors. We don't have any diodes on this chassis. So the calculated value we need is 837. And next standard size up, as it says here, so just the off-the-shelf available resistors are 910. Mind you, this value doesn't need to be 100% accurate because it just affects the brightness of the OSD, not the RGB Scart input. So let's go back to our schematics. We are leaving the 5.6 inline resistors. We are removing the termination resistors, the 910. And what we are doing is then here, for instance, in this jumper or anywhere on the board that you can, after the 5.6 inline resistors, you implement your inline resistors that we have calculated are 910. In this case, they are the same value as a termination, but that's not always the case. So let's have a look how we can implement this on the chassis. In this particular one, we have this E9 header that I believe was for teletext and has 3 pins for RGB, and TT1 here is a big ground. So what we can do is we can inject our 910 calculated resistors on the RGB lines, twist the ends with the 75 ohm, and the 375 ohm ones are tied together to the big ground. Now, the 3 twisted bits on top here can be used to go straight to the Scart input. It's already terminated and it should be correct as per the mux calculation sheet and table. And here we can see some examples of the results of an OSD mux mod. You can clearly see the OSD overlaid over the RGB input. The OSD is somewhat transparent. It is not as opaque as you would see on a factory OSD because it's sharing the input, but it's perfectly usable. There may be some rare combination of OSD letter colors and background colors where the OSD will blend in with the background. Like you see here a little bit, the middle bar of the E is a little bit less visible, but overall it is very, very usable and much better than any other options.
DJ Cal, many thanks for schooling us on the mux mod. I couldn't have presented it better myself. Merci. Now, I should mention the alternatives when the jungle chip has no RGB inputs, essentially injecting amplified RGB directly to the transistors on the CRT's neckboard, therefore losing all control that the chassis provides, such as brightness and geometry controls. Keith from Arcade Laboratory recently showed an early version of Frankencade's RGB amplifier that does exactly this. In his demonstration, the RGB from a Ninja Turtles arcade PCB was amplified to 4 volt and hooked directly to the RGB transistors. This won't be useful for a multi-console setup, but what it sets out to achieve for a dedicated arcade cabinet with a single PCB, it looks promising. A kind of in-between neck mod would be to wire in a standalone external jungle chip. I found these jungle chip mod boards on AliExpress where you have a low voltage RCA input for your consoles and an amplified output that connects to the neckboard with an IDC connector. It has an on-screen display and potentiometers to adjust brightness, contrast and horizontal center, as well as individual RGB gains. I reached out to the seller to see if they could tell me more information about the pinout, but they weren't so helpful at answering my questions. While a neck mod is doable, either by direct RGB amplification or an external jungle chip, if it's the only option, considering you're in the higher voltage territory and the added complexity, it's not for the faint-hearted.
Oh shit.
In-depth guides for RGB mods for exact TV models and chassis are a gift to us all, solving the circuitry Rubik's Cube to make these mods accessible to the wider community. But if your TV is missing a guide, stick with the fundamentals of RGB, sync and blanking, and with the right approach, unlocking RGB on a compatible TV is achievable. You got this.
Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime.
I want to extend my gratitude to all contributors in the CRT modding scene. Because of all of you, I'm able to relive my childhood in RGB. Thanks all for watching and happy gaming.